All right. Welcome everyone to day 4 of the 2021 Planetary Health Annual Meeting, co-hosted by the University of Sao Paulo and the Planetary Health Alliance. I'm Joanna Wagner from the Planetary Health Alliance, which is based at Harvard University in Boston, Massachusetts. We're so pleased to have you join us this morning at our 4th annual meeting and our first virtual meeting and festival. We're thrilled that there are over 4,800 people registered for the conference from 129 countries, so it's truly a planetary event. We've had 3 days so far of incredible conversations and learning with thought leaders, business leaders, researchers, and planetary health practitioners from across disciplines and across the globe. Our discussions so far have covered foundational values for planetary health, knowledge, education, and funding systems, and how businesses and new economic models are allowing us to scale up to address the urgent changes needed to achieve the Great Transition. These conversations provide an excellent background for today's discussions on governance and cooperation. We've also been learning about the latest planetary health research and projects in our lightning talks and poster sessions. As a reminder, all of the main program sessions are being recorded and will be available to you on the PHA's YouTube channel. Before I introduce our upcoming panel, I just want to take a moment and remind you of a few exciting PHA program launches and housekeeping items. Individual membership in the PHA is now open. All individuals above the age of 13 are invited to join the Alliance, which you can do through our brand new online members community on the networking platform Hilo. Please also consider adding your voice to the Sao Paulo Declaration on Planetary Health Global Consultation. This declaration will be the first document of its kind from the planetary health community, outlining what actions are necessary to achieve the Great Transition. You can learn more about membership, Hilo, and the Sao Paulo Declaration in the exhibit hall of the main event hall. There you can visit the booths for Hilo and the PHA. That concludes my opening remarks. So now I'm very pleased to be introducing our first panel of the day, entitled Planetary Health Diplomacy, Saving Multilateralism to Save Ourselves. I'd like to briefly introduce our moderator, Nicole de Paula. Dr. Nicole de Paula is the inaugural Klaus Topfer Sustainability Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. For more than a decade, she's been globally connecting policymakers and researchers to create a public understanding of key issues related to sustainability, the environment, and public health. She's also the founder of the Women Leaders for Planetary Health and co-founder for an interdisciplinary research group on planetary health at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Nicole holds a PhD in the International Relations from Sciences Po Paris and has been consulting with several international organizations under the UN system on themes related to global health, climate change, biodiversity, chemicals, finance, and urban affairs. Nicole, over to you.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you so much. You've been an absolute star during this whole process. You and the whole Planetary Health Alliance team, the University of Sao Paulo team, and I feel so lucky to have worked with you all. Hello, everyone, and bon dia to my Brazilian colleagues. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for tuning in today. I truly appreciate your virtual presence with us. For more than a year, we have been working hard to make this Planetary Health Week a huge success. And I'm so happy to see that we have over now 129 countries registered for this conversation. It's really impressive. Congratulations to our teams here. And as a Brazilian, of course, I could not be happier to see this event being hosted by the University of Sao Paulo. And of course, we would have preferred to welcome you in our campus, but it's more important to be healthy at the moment. And so I do hope that you and your families are safe and that you are energized by this planetary health community. And I'm sure we'll compensate the absence of this human touch with empowering ideas today. Building bridges across communities in times of crisis is so fundamental. So we are on day 4 and the Planetary Health Annual Meeting. And today we're really going to tackle this issue of governance and global cooperation. As a scholar in international relations, of course, this session is very special to me. In January 21, just to give a little bit of a background here, I published a commentary at the Lancet Planetary Health and bringing this conversation about the notion of planetary health diplomacy. To my knowledge, that was the first time that I was using that expression. And I was surprised and happy to receive such a good feedback. But people wanted to say, how can we explore this idea even further? So our panel, Planetary Health Diplomacy, Saving Multilateralism to Save Ourselves, will do just that. We'll gather valuable insights from experienced speakers who are architects of ongoing multilateral processes. And the real question behind the notion of planetary health, we know that it goes way beyond science. We know this planetary emergency is deeply connected to social issues. And solutions from transformative action cannot happen without this effective science policy interfaces. So the $1 million today is how can we act for a healthier, greener, and just post-pandemic future? And how can global cooperation help us to deliver on these promises? It's so striking that during the COVID-19 pandemic, we of course, this perception of a deep interdependency. Many countries, on the other hand, they did not lead for an effective multilateral cooperation. How can we make sense of this paradox? I mean, there's clear evidence that we are an ongoing planetary emergency that cannot be tackled in an isolation, and yet we still struggle to promote effective multilateralism, and especially if we consider that we need to act at a much higher speed. So our conversation is very, very timely, and we know that in January 2021, President Biden officially announced that the US would rejoin the Paris Agreement, giving a new political momentum to climate diplomacy. The challenge is that to decarbonize our societies, global emissions must be halved by 2030 and reach zero by 2050. But the most recent UN assessment shows that current governmental pledge would only lead to a 1% reduction in emissions by 2030. So of course, we remain a little bit far from what is required to keep global warming below the 1.5 target degree. But global emissions are only one dimension of this planetary emergency. To me, the planetary health approach has the potential to multi-solve global threats, putting human health and ecological integrity at the core of our political choices. So to help me to think about the best way to move from words to action, I'm so honored to have three distinguished speakers with us today. They have extensive international experience and impressive CVs. So we only have 1 hour together. Please forgive me, I will provide a snapshot of your bios, but I would encourage our audience to click on the agenda to read their full CVs, but just don't get depressed, please. They really a lot that they have accomplished. And I will start with Sandrine Dixson-Declève, who is currently the co-president of the Club of Rome. And she has more than 30 years of European and international policy, business leadership, and strategy experience with a focus on the EU and international climate change, green growth, sustainable energy, and finance solutions. She holds several advisory positions for the European Commission and the UN, for example, now at the 2021 Food Summit. And Sandrine is also a senior associate and faculty member of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. In 2007, she co-founded the Women Enablers Change Agent Network, We Can. Welcome, Sandrine. So I'm also very pleased to introduce Dr. Stefanos Fotiou, who is an accomplished expert on the environment and sustainable development. He's based in Bangkok, where he's the director of the Environment and Development Division in the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia Pacific. In this capacity, Stefanos provides strategic guidance for the planning and implementation of the UN SCAP work on sustainable management of natural resources, climate change, and sustainable urban development. He's coordinating SCAP's overall approach on supporting the implementation of the 2030 Agenda to deliver the UN Sustainable Development Goals. He holds a PhD in Natural Resources Economics from Aristotle University in Greece. Good evening, Stefanos. And I have, of course, also our Dr. Rolph Payet, who is the Executive Secretary at the UN Secretary for the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions since October 2014. He was previously Minister of Environment and Energy in Seychelles, and in 2008, he founded the first university in Seychelles, where he also served as its first president and vice chancellor. Previously, he contributed to the reports of the IPCC, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, and he's also a founding member of a number of conservation-oriented foundations, such as the Global Island Partnership, the Sea Level Rise Foundation, the Seychelles University Foundation, the Island Conservation Society, and the Silhouette Foundation. He has received numerous international awards for his work, including the Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum, and an honorary doctorate in science from the University of London. Welcome, Rolph. So before we start, just some logistics here. We're going to have then short inputs by our three panelists. These inputs will be followed by some questions. We're going to hope to have a very lively dialogue, but I would encourage you all to already send your questions if you have some, so we have time to have also to curate your questions. So I would like to start with ladies first, and perhaps invite Sandrine to share with us your assessment of these opportunities to promote a green recovery in this post-pandemic world and how planetary health fits into this narrative. Thank you all and welcome.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And it's such a pleasure to be with all of you. And really, I appreciate this planetary health event and the conference itself. I think it's so fundamental. As you know, 3 years ago, we released our planetary emergency plan, and this was before the pandemic. And already then we were talking about the convergence of two key tipping points, the biodiversity loss alongside the climate shock and crisis. Now we can talk about 3 key, and I would even say 4 key tipping points. Obviously, biodiversity loss, climate, and the health pandemic, alongside also what I would call the social tipping point, the Black Lives Matter, the call to the streets of people who are indicating that citizens matter and that they want to be part of governance process. So that's why it's so important that we talk today about both the planetary health, planetary emergency issues, but also what does that mean in terms of governance? And you can see that I'm wearing my SDG pin here, which is, and many of us have them, but why is it important to wear it? And I think that I wear it every day to remind me that, first of all, the SDGs were all about what it truly means to be sustainable, bringing together a systems approach. What we are about at the Club of Rome, as you know, is that we need to optimize our systems. So if we are currently within the convergence of tipping points, we need to think about what institutions need to shift in order to ensure that actually we can react to those tipping points. I often ask people, how is it possible that we don't have an emergency plan, whether it be at the international level or whether it be at the national or the local level? We do now have 1,700 plus jurisdictions that have declared an emergency, but now we need to translate it. We need to translate it at the local and the national and the international level. We need to ensure that we have cross narratives. So you mentioned that I am actually the co-chair of the action track on resilience for the Food System Summit, run by the US and the UN, sorry, not by the US. And what we've realized is that even though we are talking to countries with regard to agriculture, clearly we are engaging with agricultural ministers. We are not engaging with the same ministers that are actually going to be doing the negotiations on the climate side at COP. So what we are trying to do now is to cross-fertilize the narratives to ensure that when we talk about food, we think about, in particular when it comes to resilience, fragile zones, vulnerable zones, access to food, and ensure that we speak about the crises that are impacting our food system so that we can guarantee healthy food on a healthy planet, which is the One Health concept. In addition to that, we know that we need to influence our governments when they talk about trade through the G7 or economic shifts, both through the G7 and the G20, that we need to have the same narrative when we talk about biodiversity through the CBD COP. So when we're talking about shifting the governance, we need to get much more strategic ourselves in terms of our calls to action. We need to realize that we have to influence at different levels. We have to influence decision makers within the international realm, but also the member states and the countries that are negotiating on our behalf. And then as citizens need to call for action and shifts at the local level and ensure that they have impact and that they're being heard. The last key point that I want to make in this short intervention before we have a discussion is actually 2 key areas that are fundamental. One is that economic shift that I brought forward. This is not just about business as usual. This is about building forward better. Don't talk to me about building back, because we cannot build back the glaciers that have already melted. So there's no building back. It's building forward. And to build forward, we have to finance that.
Did we miss Sandrine a little bit? Okay, I think so it was not only me, but I think she already brought so many of the key points for this conversation. And I really like also this idea of this cross-fertilizing the narratives, right? I think that's so, to me, also why I'm so passionate about planetary health is how the importance of bringing this multiple crises, but not to just complement the crisis, right? We're trying and looking for the solutions for this translation. So perhaps I can move to Stefanos and see your reactions into this. How do you feel about that?
So, Nicole, thanks for the intro. Thanks for putting this panel together. I will start with what you mentioned about Sandrine, putting things together, the system approach, which is completely missing. I am 16 years in the UN system, and even before this, I was dealing with advising governments, and I saw that there were so many cases where one ministry was not talking to the other ministry. And sometimes this was happening, and it's still happening because there's a lack of information, but sometimes it's happening because even of competition within the same government. And we have seen cases where the ministers will fight for resources, will fight for everything, and they will start even having small wars. Now, having said that, for me, the most important thing about this 4 tipping crisis that Sandrine described is how much we will change completely the way we plan and the way we decide our development policies. And I think that the pandemic showcased 3 big things to us. One is that we cannot separate nature from human development. The COVID-19 is the zoonosis. It happened because we broke completely the links between the environment and our human development. I see Sandrine is back. But Sandrine, we have moved to me now. The second thing, Nicole, is that I've seen that we proved that the development model that was based on the 60s and the 70s economic decision tools and economic thinking, it was completely wrong. And unfortunately, until today, we continue using the tools of the 60s and the 70s, the wrong tools like these tools of the computational general equilibrium, which assumes that we are all rational and we take rational decisions, to decide on infrastructure, to decide on allocation of budgets, to decide on how we spend public money. And I think this is completely wrong. And I hope that this pandemic will prove that the way we were designing economic policies until today was fundamentally wrong, and we need to change it, not to go back. We should not go back there. We should start from something that says, I'm not going to use an econometric model to do the planning of my infrastructure. I'm going to use the carrying capacity of ecosystems to understand how much I can request from nature. I need to use the carrying capacity of the ocean to understand how much I'm going to concentrate on fishing and how much fishing I will allow and to whom I will allow to fish. Also, we need to use the carrying capacity of the atmosphere to understand how much pollution we can accept, and we shouldn't accept more. So that's the second point. Replace all the economic tools that come from the 60s and the 70s with a new science-based decision-making, which is based on ecosystems, on environment. And the third point is that if you want to change things fast, you change things fast with regulations and with pricing. So I am a strong believer on education. I'm a strong believer on capacity development. I have come where I have come because I had access to free education. But if we want rapid change, and we need rapid change, we need to change our pricing, our finance, and the way we allocate our resources. So that's as I started, Nicole, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
And before I have so many questions already, and what I'm hearing is that of course we need to use this pandemic is not to build back better. That's really like not what we want. However, I'm just like to throw out there: is the mindset there? Do you feel in your experience and case studies before? I want to hear Rolph before we go to this question, but it's just on the mindset, because if we look at the data, you see that less than 1/5 of fiscal spending in 2020 contributed to a green recovery. And that's all data now from this year from Oxford in partnership. So although we have that argument there, we are not seeing concretely these transformations. But I would like to hear if you have success stories. And Rolph, how do you feel then about these questions in this debate so far? In your experience, because you're also coming and it likes to highlight your area. And of course, you have a lot of connections with health through waste and chemicals and this transboundary pollution and negotiations, right? So what's your experience with this pandemic? How is it shifting?
Thank you very much, Nicole. But before I get to this, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on multilateralism, because I think we often take it for granted. I mean, with the founding of the UN in the 1940s, after the Great War, obviously, we saw this, propagation of peace and well-being on the planet, despite all the different challenges. Many countries became republics, became independent. They learned how to manage themselves. Then we had the huge revival in the 1970s with the human development, which will now celebrate 50 years next year in Sweden, Stockholm, coming from that, the Rio conventions. And then somebody mentioned the sustainable development framework. But what we've seen, and personally what I've seen in the last 30 years after negotiating the biodiversity conventions, the climate change conventions, and now working in pollution and chemicals conventions, and a number of other conventions related to biodiversity, is I've seen this slow evolution, whether for good or for bad, of multilateralism. But I've seen sometimes it has been under a lot of attack. I think today multilateralism is still under attack. We've seen, for example, new actors. This is not an attack, but I think it's good. We've had new actors besides governments. We've been looking at how we can engage stakeholders. We can engage the private sector, especially in my area where I work with chemicals and waste. How do we engage with industry, especially in trying to move towards a more sustainable approach to production and consumption, and looking and seeing evolve or unfold polarization, for example, which we've seen in the last few years. We've seen regionalization, we've seen nationalization. Even with COVID-19, we've seen the forces of nationalism, at play. We've seen the rise of extremism. We've seen a rise of popular movements, not only at national level, but also globally, facilitated by social media and all this. So this has all had an impact on how the future of multilateralism will be. And I think it's important not to forget that the whole future of humanity will depend on how this multilateralism will evolve in the future. So I just wanted to put this caveat here before we get on to discussion. The second one I want to put on the table is, of course, the elephant in the room. Yes, I've been with biodiversity. It's great, biodiversity, climate change, fantastic topics to talk about. Now it's health. But the elephant in the room is pollution, consumption. When we all stopped moving, what happened? The dolphins came back, the birds came back, the trees flowered, the bees were all over the place. We don't need to worry about biodiversity and climate change. We need to worry about humans. The human impact on this planet is what we need to start thinking about. And it seems sometimes it's easier for us to be talking about saving trees, saving this, saving that, but forgetting that we need to save ourselves from ourselves. And I think I'm just being philosophical here to really bring home to the point. And pollution is really driving a lot of the problems today. The core root cause of climate change is pollution, it's emissions from all the activities that we are doing, whether it's clearing of forests, whether it's driving our cars, whether it's inefficient energy consumption. I can go on and on. And I think it's important to really understand that this is part of the, solving pollution is also very much part of the solution that we have, that we need to reflect on. I mean, today, if you go around the world, there's one particular bottle from one particular company you will find anywhere in the world. And that study came out and said, look, this bottle, anywhere you go in the world, even in Antarctica, you will find a bottle of that soft drink. Now, seriously, this is something for us to think about. Where have we failed? How the markets have failed? How our economies have failed? We've brought a lot of prosperity. We brought a lot of, we've addressed poverty in some measure, but in many areas we've gone backwards. The other point before I end up is related to health. A recent report came out 3 weeks ago, which showed decreasing fertility among men. Now, this is a serious medical issue, you know, because it impacts on our survival as a human, and they are all related to all the things that I've talked about in the last few minutes. Is the decrease, and there was a movie, I think, which we talked about a time when women were not becoming pregnant anymore. Yes, maybe that's a futuristic movie, maybe it will never happen. But all these are signs that our planet is sick, both from a health and environmental perspective, and we need to do something about it by really addressing those bottom line issues, what Sandrine has told, the tipping points, and I'm adding a core tipping point here, which is consumption. Thank you. Over to you, Nicole.
Thank you. And you brought also a so important point, because my motivation even to discuss the planetary health diplomacy, it's because multilateralism seems to be under attack, and we have many examples out there. So I would also would like to hear, because it was an interesting statement from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who mentioned there is a surplus of multilateral challenge, but a deficit of multilateral solutions. And this is a very recent, and that's the paradox, right? How do we move the planetary, if we need to break the silos, and Sandrine, you're also mentioning on this, we need to shift the institutions, this governance structures, right? But the way that we build in the sectoral, is the climate change, the pollution, we know that these things are together. And now we have this wave, perhaps, of populism. The pandemics is a very difficult moment. And so how do we move this conversation to bring this cohesive into diplomacy? And I know, Sandrine, also perhaps you wanted to discuss, you were talking about economy and you're finished. So maybe I'll go back to you so you can develop the last final point and complement that.
Yeah, nothing like disappearing in the middle of your speech. Sorry about that. First of all, can I just thank Stefanos and Rolph for excellent inputs, and I could not agree with both of you more. I mean, you were spot on. And I think, Rolph, your last point around consumption, I mean, clearly that's dear to our heart at the Club of Rome, where we've been talking about overconsumption for the last 50 years. And what I wanted to relay, actually, is that this is the beauty of what we're starting to see as new economic models. I fully agree, that is the core of the problem. It is the way in which, first of all, we value growth, which is totally the wrong value, rather than putting a real value on what matters. And the fact that we continue to promote GDP as the only value of growth, rather than looking at other indicators, which are social, environmental, and also economic. So your point, Rolph, around needing to rethink our anthropocentrism, as the Pope has so rightly said, we are so caught up in the ego and our individual right to do everything that we are absolutely not living in balance with the other species, because we have the right to do whatever we want, which is overconsume and destroy and actually become our greatest risk, which is exactly what you said. Two key new models, which I think are really important. The new well-being models that are being taken on board by Finland, Iceland, New Zealand, Wales, and I've forgotten one, Scotland, who are really looking at that trilogy of indicators, social, economic, and environment together, coming out of the pandemic, the most resilient, by the way, including companies that have looked at ESG, so environmental, social, and governance factors through their entire value chain. We've seen a tripling of investment in ESG-proof companies over the pandemic because they are the most risk resistant. Come back to Rolf's very good point. They are looking at the way in which we consume, how we can shift our consumption models, etc. The other key model is the donut economic model that is now being applied at the local level in Amsterdam and Brussels and in other areas. Also looking at our impact within boundaries, but bringing in the social factors at the same time. And how that is starting to really shift the way in which communities are developing and looking at future and alternative futures.
And this is super important because you gave us already this a success story in terms of investments are shifting to the companies, or this process there seems to be more resilient, and that's essential. That's where we're going to start. We need to talk about finance here, right, and investments. But Stefanos, you mentioned this. How do we concretely also advance this planetary health diplomacy approach at the governmental sphere? And I think you also have suggestions of because negotiators, when they go to talk about these things, they need to have this notion perhaps in mind. So do you have suggestions? How can we do that?
Yeah, I have a couple of suggestions, and actually an experience that it's coming from something we ran very recently in the UNESCAP. I mean, today we finished our annual commission session, which is the apex body of ESCAP. It's something like the equivalent of the General Assembly, but for Asia Pacific. And we managed to have the member states there agreeing on a resolution which included aspects of the relation between human health and health of the ecosystems. The countries didn't manage to agree to include one of these popular terms, either planetary health or One Health. And I have to tell you that even from our side, from the secretariats, we said, okay, let's try to support countries to find something to put the content there. Because we are not so much, I mean, after many years of negotiations, I don't believe so much that we need to spend a lot of diplomatic time on focusing on the specific keywords. But we put some context there, yeah? And we put this context because we have done, I think, some good background work. We have created background documents which the countries understood that the COVID-19 pandemic is a zoonosis. It's not a laboratory thing. It's not a conspiracy theory. And we put it in front of them and they agreed. I think we need more steps. We need at one point to put the word planetary health or One Health in official UN documents, in resolutions, in decisions. How we can do this? The number one entry point is some champion countries. You know that there is some champion countries that they will go to the ECOSOC with a resolution, or why not the COP, the biodiversity COP. Still, there is space probably to include the concept of planetary health in the outcome document, or the HLPF, the high-level political forum. And you know, the ones of you that you have worked with the UN, you know that the UN Secretariat is not the one that can start this discussion. It should start from a member state. But if we have champion member states that they will bring this into the table, I think that's a very good approach. So Antonio was saying that you have managed to put here 4,800 participants from 129 countries. One of them should have a good access to a Ministry of Foreign Affairs and try to pitch the idea to them that go to the next General Assembly or to the ECOSOC or to the HLPF or to the COP15 of biodiversity or to the COP26 and put the planetary health concept in one of the outcome documents. Thank you.
So in the end, the language matters, Stefanos. It's like we cannot, that's the challenge, because we cannot spend too much time, but then language matters.
Yes.
But
I say it's good for a first step to contextualize things. And even now, I think if a country will go to the General Assembly or to the ECOSOC, could use our resolution and say in Asia Pacific, they adopted a resolution that recognizes the links between health, ecosystem health and human health, and makes reference to the health of the planet.
For sure. And I think also discussing with Rolph in parallel, we had conversations, but I would also like to hear from your experience, Rolph, in these negotiations and chemicals, and of course, health. It has to be a central dimension of this conversation of pollution. But how is it then really perceived? Because you have a lot of technical negotiations there, and sometimes we tend to forget that it's about the human health. Is it correct? Is it happening in your context? And how do you see a potential solution to overcome that?
Thanks, Nicole. We've walked many negotiating corridors together, so it's been a long journey, and sometimes been really painful because we've spent time negotiating about things that really will not have any impact on bringing about the change that we want. And at times we've negotiated on things that really have meaning and I think has really have made an impact. So I come to answer this question in a very lukewarm, too hot, maybe cold sometimes in there. But in the current space that I work in, especially in chemicals and waste, in the last 5 years, we've seen an increased number of chemicals being submitted for listing to our conventions, and some of them large groups of chemicals. For example, a large group of chemicals I can mention is in the pans, in the pans, the coating in the pans. That was a real breakthrough because everybody thought that they were cooking in nice pans because it was non-stick pans. It was a modernity. But then we realized that they contain very toxic chemicals which accumulate into our bodies, into women, and impacts childbirth and all these other impacts. So really there's been a strong push and a strong movement, but it's not fast enough. And that's one of the challenges. You need a lifetime to see the differences. I mean, I understand because different countries have different needs, different expectations, and different policies. But for me, I'm saddened when there is moral irresponsibility. I mean, I can give you some examples. Is when governments tell its people that if you can't cut down the forest, then you will get richer, you'll get better jobs. When you increase fishing, you will get more money, you will be well off. This kind of short-termism, which of course dominated by, of course, the political systems that we have. I know we have democracies, but the politicians who are elected for 4 or 5 years have no long-term, not expectations, no visions in the long term. And I think that has a huge impact on both diplomacy, but also on the environment and also on health, because the decisions are taken only within the time or the horizon, which they feel are important for them. And myself, being in politics, I've seen this play out so profoundly, and with all the people I've interacted with. So I'm just trying to call here, that we all have, especially those in leadership, have a moral responsibility as well, and not just wait for negotiations and to take action, because when we show leadership, then I think the negotiations can go a lot faster, but also can bring the whole discourse forward, the whole movement forwards. And I think this is, in my view, not good enough. We need more of it.
And you're talking about leadership, and it's so essential, this topic, because I want to talk with Sandrine. You have been elected one of the 30 most influential women in this green business, and you know a lot about leadership. And I could not leave this panel without asking you, so what's the role of this gender equality and women empowerment and putting more women in positions of leadership to shift? And so perhaps is this a way to accelerate action for planetary health? How do you see this specific theme of women empowerment?
So thank you, Nicole, for that question. And I think we should also ask Rolph and Stefanos what they think about women in leadership, because it's always asked as a woman, but I think often it's men who also support women who are fundamentally important in making the transition. A few thoughts on that very important question. It builds on a conversation I just had this morning with Paula, who is the co-president of the Club of Rome. And we are the first 2 women, actually, to preside the club in 50 years. So just think, it took 50 years for the Club of Rome to have a woman, and they decided to have 2, so not bad, representing 2 very different jurisdictions, myself being in Europe and Paula being in South Africa. But I think what you said to me is exactly what I feel to contribute, which is that women are the carriers of the seed, right? We carry children in our womb, and also when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to new thinking at community level, often women are the carriers, whether it be that intellectual seed or whether it be the actual seed. She was telling me that women in Africa often hide new types of seeds under their pillows because they want to make sure they preserve that seed for future generations. So think of that analogy. And if we do take that into the importance of bringing women in, I mean, apart from the fact that we know that we are a very and bigger part of the population than men across the globe, there needs to be absolutely more women in decision-making at all levels. But also, we need to remember that because women are the carriers of the seed, in particular in economies of transition, where many women are at the head of communities, where many women are thinking much more collectively rather than driven by power, then we need to think about those are the new models of the future. They're the ones that are thinking about the impact that future generations will be feeling because we have not taken into consideration our consumption patterns or the way in which we act. So we need women in decision making. And what we have seen, as I indicated, with these well-being economies, they're all steered by women, except for one Welsh very smart president who's decided to follow their lead, who's a man. But these women have actually led through their well-being economy thinking and models, and also coming out of COVID, very much had different styles in governing. They actually immediately communicated with people. They were not driven by being criticized by their peers. They were driven by ensuring that they could save their people and the people's livelihoods first. And that is often why it's so important to have more women in power. Now, we've seen disastrous circumstances where women have not been collective thinkers. Thatcher comes to mind, but there are others. But I do think overall, women tend to be, because they are carriers of the seed, thinking about the next generation, and also much more collective and systemic in their approach and to the economy.
And I think you brought this point, Sandrine, of having male support to this cause. And I'm very comfortable in this panel because I know my two colleagues here, Stefanos and Rolph, they're very, very strong supporters of, and also at least I can talk from the work that we do at the Women Leaders for Planetary Health. And it's so, it's a pleasure to see how this question is evolving. So I would also pose this question to you, Stefanos and Rolph, to react, because I know you're very strong advocates.
With great pleasure, Nicole. So you remember when we had the event on the Women Leaders of Planetary Health, I said something and I want to repeat it. The climate and the biodiversity catastrophes have been created by a development system that has been completely developed only by men. So the ones that they decided, the post-war economic system, it was only men. See what happened in the Bretton Woods summit, how many women were there, 0. Who designed the economic policies, and even who negotiated some of the agreements that they have failed. So I don't want to start saying, that women might be more clever or something like this, but you lose diversity. When you don't have women in the negotiation table, you lose diversity. And, as people that we have studied biology, we believe that by diversity, either biodiversity or socio-diversity or diversity of thoughts, it's what makes systems more stable, and we miss this. We need more women at the table, and I want to repeat here the pledge that I took in your meeting, which I continue saying this year, although I will plan to go to the COP, I will not go to the COP, and I will give my seat to the COP in a qualified women colleague from my office. Now, how we can create this? I think, I don't know how to say this politically correct. Women need to become extremely more activist when it comes to demanding a seat on the table. I do understand we are living in the era of political correctness and we can't spell out some words, but we need a lot of activism from the women's side to be coupled with the activism that Sandrine mentioned in the beginning about the Black Lives Matter, about a kind of emergence of global consciousness on sustainability that I think it's happening, but we really need to have women activists that they will go out and they will demand things and they will put through things. There might even a case here that we need to create a lot of noise around this thing. And I think by the creation of noise, some women that can help a lot are women entrepreneurs. And I live in a country that's in Thailand that, although it's not taking credits when it comes to the participation of women on politics, because it's almost non-existing, when it comes to the participation of women in the corporate sector, and you see the number of women CEOs in Thailand, you understand that in things that they matter, women have a leadership role here. So I think that if we couple more activism with more engagement from women that are in the corporate sector, and they have, you know, I think to survive as a woman in a corporate sector, you really need to have been activist before in your life. I think this could give a good solution.
More noise and more activism. And thanks for repeating your pledge, Stefanos. And remember, we had this conversation in December last year, and you're repeating this. And we have 2 videos and the copies coming up. We're going to follow up on these promises. And Rolph, how do you then, from your perspective, so we need more noise, and how do you see this happening in your environment there?
Well, I will take a different outlook. Of course, I'm totally, fully supportive and engaged, of course, in whole gender parity and encouraging women, because this is very important. Obviously, we have a huge imbalance. There's huge unfairness. I've seen it myself throughout my career. Even, you know, when I started designing the university, my goal was for education. And when the university started, I suddenly realized it was for women, because in Seychelles, when the women start family earlier, they cannot be free to go and study abroad for university. There was no university. And suddenly I had 80% students coming to the university were women. And today, some of these women are now in leadership positions in my country, in companies around in the region. So I'm really proud. So for me, I started off with an education objective and actually fulfilling the dreams of many women. And still today, many women find that it is easier because they stay in the country, they attend the school, and of course there is a family at the same time, and then they get jobs and take a very active role. Because this is a very important barrier which I've seen throughout my career, which stop. And I know many countries have these conscious barriers in place which actually prevent women from getting education, from getting educated. And as a result, then of course these women are not skilled enough to take up to replace men's jobs. But anyway, that is my life history in my learning, my learning about how we can design policies and change policies to increase the participation and engagement, but also not only participation and engagement, but their leadership role in society. And I think that's important, not just to allow them to talk or allow them to sit at the table, but to allow them to take decisions and to be part of those decisions and to be part of the future. I think that's equally important. One area I just wanted to approach here is women in health. Women have a very, very, very extremely strong role in health. And not only in the home. I mean, it's my wife that runs after me to go and to take the kids for eye testing, for checking this, for checking that, just as an aside. But it just shows you because of that seed that Sandrine has mentioned, it's inbuilt for them to look after the family, to take care of the family. I'm not saying that in a bad way, but I'm saying it in a very important way. This affinity to good health, to putting health as a priority, I think we see the evidence. And I think if we are to move towards progress in planetary health, then we need those women in those leadership positions, because with them they bring this not only this passion, but this inbuilt desire to really achieve good health. You see what I'm trying to say? And I think there is an important role to play there. On the other hand, there's an important role to also bring the men on board, because they need to feel that this is also their responsibility as well, to be part of this planetary health transformation, because this is the topic we're talking about here. And it is not just the responsibility of women, because they are seen as the primary carers of the family or looking after health issues, that then the men are devoid of responsibility. So we also have a responsibility to also bring the men into this kind of discussion and this kind of decision making. And I think I need further reflection on this, but while Sandrine was thinking, this is what was going through my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Rolph, for bringing this concrete example of, the building an university in a small island state and giving this, the opportunity for education, because when we reach the stage of negotiations, who is going to be there, right? You have to empower, and the legitimacy of these international negotiations has to have the participation of all states, not only from the north, and that's another topic that we tend to highlight here, the importance of the global south in general in taking and shaping the decisions at the UN level. For example, that's a very important thing. So I believe also the discussion the UN reform, it's a very important aspect of our conversation here. I know, Sandrine, you have to leave in 8 minutes, and we do have we have until 5:10, but we have a few questions here from our participants. Thank you for sending them. And so we have almost two here, is that somebody's asking here, what are the panelists' thoughts on how to inspire governments, actors to build forward? So I think perhaps a little bit on this mindset, and we touched a little bit on this issue. Others are asking about our economic system. Is it possible within a capitalism system to not have consumption and pollution? So I think this is, I'll make a round here. Perhaps, Sandrine, can we start with you?
Yeah. So I've been looking at the questions. I've tried to answer some, as I know that I need to pop off. So I apologize for that. I think that the first question is very important. So, how can we actually build forward better? Well, right now, the recovery plans are fundamental. All reform and recovery plans that are coming out of countries must actually be both climate, social, and environmental proof. And that's what we're trying to do at the European level right now. In fact, I have an op-ed that's coming out tomorrow on nature proofing our recovery, because a lot of greenwashing is happening in the member states. And you might remember that we need to have at least 35 to 37% of the funds mainstreamed and earmarked for more environmental, climate, and other projects, which is good, but we're not seeing the same thing across the globe. So I would say that building forward better means right now citizens and activists and businesses that really want to be part of the future should be pushing for that funding to not go backwards, but actually to build the economy of the future. And coming to the economy of the future is some of the questions around, how do we ensure the economy of the future in both developing and developed areas, as well as what are the models. And we're in the process right now of working with the Potsdam Institute, as you know, Nicole, and also the Norwegian Business School on what we call the Earth for All project, which will update our original modeling around the limits to growth and start to put forward new pathways, pluralistic pathways, moving towards well-being type economies. We are then stress testing against some top economic thinkers, multidisciplinary thinkers from across the globe, south and north, that will stress test models. And with policymakers, we will co-create new pathways, scenarios for what we will call, let's say, new economic development pathways not built on the growth model. And so we are doing that, and then it will become a big campaign. We hope we will launch all of this at the Stockholm conference and our 50th anniversary, which happened to be the same year, so that's next year, and would love to speak further about that. I think that the key question around how to get other economies to think this way is to do some very clear narrative building. Number one, this is the first generation ever to make less than its parents. This is the first time ever where actually a generation has the highest suicide rates. So the youth have the highest suicide rates, and we have the highest mental disease. We have the greatest disparity between the rich and the poor in the richest countries, not just in the developing economies. So the message there has to be, you cannot tell me that the model is not broken. Hence, should we not, as a global society, build forward a very different model that guarantees people the right access to the right essentials? And the last point I would make is, please, let's tap into the conscience of all of us who have been through COVID. And I can tell you the surveys are showing us that people don't want to go back to business as usual. They said what said by Rolph and Stefanos. They loved hearing those birds sing. They loved being in nature. They believe that actually deep down, it's most important access to essential things in life and preservation of their lives and livelihoods and those of those that they love. That's what we need to convince those economies that are on an egomaniac power-mongering process rather than thinking about the collective and the eco and still going back to the ego.
Thank you, Sandrine. And I thank you also. I know you're going to leave us soon, so thank you for your participation and bringing this energy. And we do need more pressure because it's not easy to make this pressure and achieve. And you know, we work a lot of the EU level, even the negotiations that go even in this region that is highly developed, highly engaged, it's not an easy one. So we need a lot of pressure. I continue this. So Stefanos, also from you, and I think it could be interesting to bring also this Asia Pacific perspective. And if we bring it to the topic of geopolitics, right, how also power is shifting in this time and how do we have to build new systems? And the question was a little bit, is it possible within the capitalist model? And so what's your take on that one?
Yeah, I think when it comes to Asia, it's not only the power, is the increasing share of responsibility. If you see, for example, and you know, this is something sometimes I bring to technical discussions in the developing countries, they are looking at me with half eye, but we need to see, if we see the cumulative emissions of CO2, we will see how after 1990, the Asia starts to have a much bigger contribution there. And the same is happening when it comes to the consumption of natural resources. When it comes to energy resources also, Asia is still the less efficient region in the world. And actually, this is something that it goes together. I mean, because it's extremely inefficient, it produces much more emissions. And all of this economic miracle of Asian tigers and giants, you will allow me to say that it happened at the expense of the natural environment and the natural resources. We made this study in ESCAP, we released it a couple of months ago, and we reviewed the recovery packages of about 35 governments, and we tried to see if they were green. And the answer was a resounding no, they were not. In some of them, there was some discussion about greening the recovery, but when you were looking at the actual measures, there was nothing green. Something that worried us when we saw the recovery packages in Asia is that a return to the fossil fuel subsidies. Some countries, they have been pivotal here in Asia, reducing and some eliminating the fossil fuel subsidies. They go back to them. And this is very, very negative. We saw some aspects of greening when it came to the water, because for many countries, especially in South and Southwest Asia, the water is a big issue. But we didn't see the financing of a green recovery. We didn't see the economic measures that they will do a green recovery. In the commission, which I said you that it ended today, we come out of this commission more optimistic because a lot of countries explicitly, they mentioned the need for a green recovery. And they mentioned it at the level of the head of state. So we had about even more than 50 head of states that they addressed the commission, and the majority of them, they took about green recovery, and they took about the need to make the recovery compatible with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. So the advocacy is there, and there was a question in the Q&A that I tried to answer on what it needs to be done to convince the governments to change the economic models. And I think the first thing is we need to put a lot of evidence, hard evidence in front of them that preventing it's less costly than mitigating and tackling the problem. And I think this is something, and I'm trying to answer another question here, something that panels like the IPBS, the IPCC could start doing. You know, I think panels like the IPBS, the IPCC have done the world a better place. But still, they need to go a step beyond the scientific reports and bring the concrete policy messages to the decision makers. I have to tell you that even for myself, sometimes it's difficult to read some of these reports, and I'm not expecting that the policymakers sometimes can understand. So we need, and if these panels don't want to do this because they don't have this mandate, I think the rest of the UN system could, and other development partners, they should work with them. And this is what we do now in ESCAP with the IPCC, with IPBS, with the International Resource Panel, to take these messages and pass it to the policymakers, but with a language that they understand. And the language that the policymakers understand is how this policy will create jobs, how this policy will take people out of poverty. So if we couple our environmental narrative and our climate narrative with a narrative that says we will create jobs, we will take people out of poverty, and we will increase the well-being of the people, we have a lot of chances to succeed.
Thank you, Stefanos. You're bringing always this, there's a tension, right? Because we talk a lot about how to translate this knowledge. And if you're saying even us sometimes struggles to read these reports, so the policymakers will not make the time to read them and act. But we need to also, this language of the prevention, how much also money we can save. You know, this only this pandemic, we're now spending more, around $10 trillion. And we know that with 28 billion, of biodiversity finance, for example, we could prevent a lot of pandemics. And that's a very important numbers that I think one of my roles, I'm not a medical doctor, you know, I'm not, so I also have to do, I see my role as translating. We need to go into this, as Sandrine was saying, go into different communities and plant a seed of this narrative that is cohesive and will bring us out of this crisis. So Rolph, do you have also any recommendation on that, comments from this perspective?
Yes.
I
will try to also answer some of the questions, and I will use it with a very simple illustration. I spent maybe 8 to 10 years of my lifetime trying to convince my government to shift to renewable energy. And I will share with you the argument I was given today. They told me that the more electricity that the people consume, the more fuel that they import, and the more tax they collect. This is the kind of thinking that this world needs to get rid of. So it's not about capitalism, socialism, communism, or whatever. It's this kind of thinking that we have an infinite resource of everything and money can buy and save all of it. Last 2 weeks ago, I gave a lecture at the university, online lecture, about money grows on trees. And I convinced them that indeed money grows on trees, because today a tree is actually more valuable than money in the bank. I mean, if you go to Europe here, you get an interest on your money at 0.1, 0.2%. So, and that tree probably is much more valuable. So I'm just presenting this as an illustration for us to understand the whole context of the value that we put on money and the value that we put on our natural resources, on our health, on our well-being. So we have a society today that puts value on money rather than on those natural or health or values. And what we've seen, yes, like Sandrine mentioned, people now want to hear the birds singing. How much are you willing to pay? I mean, millionaires come to Seychelles and try and buy a piece of land or buy an island to try and get the birds to sing. Because in the cities, there's no more birds anymore. There's nothing anymore. There's no fish. So we are now increasingly eating aquaculture fish because we've overfished our natural resources, because we have not put in place, because the driving force was money. And I think that changing value, both in terms of education in the schools, both in terms of the way business are structured. Today, a CEO, I mean, I don't blame those companies. A CEO, if you somebody who invests in stock exchange knows very well, there's quarterly evaluation on how the company is doing. And if the company has gone up 14 points, yeah, you are doing very well. If the company has done down 15 points, but actually did a project to support the community or invested in renewable energy, is not given any kudos. That's the way, that's the mindset that needs to be changed. We need to give appreciation to companies who are seriously making a difference, not to companies who are just declaring profits and declaring, you know,
around the world who would like to know how they can really make a difference?
So my advice, Nicole,
Oh,
if I start, sorry, Rolph.
No, it's okay. Carry on, Stefan.
Okay, so my advice would be try to do things that they have to do with giving to the government's tools to make better decisions. You want to have research that it will contribute to better decision making. You want to have research that it will probably do reverse completely the decision making process when it comes to planning, infrastructure, biodiversity conservation, everything. The second thing I would say to the students is try to walk the talk of sustainability through the research that you're doing. I do believe that the drivers of environmental degradation are, of course, the ones creating the products, but as consumers, we consume the product. And if we can walk the talk of sustainability by sometimes stopping to doing things, then I think this is a great example. And number three, I would say to the students is try to do something that it really gives value to the things you believe. So unfortunately, I was raised up in a generation that we had to go to the university because we had to find a good job. But I think it's most important to go to university to do something that fulfills you as a human being.
Thank you, Stefanos. That's really beautiful. And Rolph, we have 1 minute in your closing remarks.
Yes.
Your advice.
Multidisciplinary research is very important. Universities cannot operate as silos. Your social sciences people need to talk to the science people, need to talk to the economists, create a lab around this and try to come up with innovative solutions that will influence policymakers, because in the science, we don't have a solution. In the economics purely, we need to bring them together. So bring those sciences together and do multidisciplinary research. And I think we will see good results. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you. And I agree with that. And my own advice would also be brave. Let's co-create solutions. And we need to get out of our comfort zone. And I think we're all doing this very beautifully. And I'm so thankful for your time and for your insights. Thank you to all our participants. And I think I will see you in the next panel that continues this conversation in a very complimentary. Thank you, Stefanos. Thank you, Rolph. And I'll see you all very soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Thanks to all. Thank you so much. Bye, Rolph. Bye, Nicole.
Bye, everyone.